Hi, and welcome to Dynamics GP Tips and Tricks. So our agenda today is 3 parts. We're going to talk about setting up GP for success for all of your staff members, navigating GP with ease, and getting information that you need from GP. Now, what brought me to this idea for this presentation? Everybody likes tips and tricks, but I noticed once I started at ITI, I was working a lot with clients who were onboarding new team members and thought there are definitely ways we can set up GP for success to help you in that process of onboarding new team members, showing another team member what you do, and things like that. So, the very first thing, the chart of accounts. Now, how many of you nearly pull your hair out at the end of the month reconciling your AP to the general ledger, or your cash account, or your accounts receivable account, things like that? So what can we do to set you up to make that process easier? Let's go to GP. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up my accounts payable account. So, think about how yours is set up. You maybe haven't looked at this for a while. And think about how mine might look different. First of all, are you allowing account entry? What does this mean? Do you allow people to post directly to this account within the general ledger? If you're posting to the accounts payable account right in the general ledger, chances are then you might not be able to reconcile that transaction back to the AP module because that transaction doesn't exist. Other things I've got here, you'll notice I've got the categories set as accounts payable. And many of you might think, well, how does that help me? Well, FRX can use these categories to create quick financial statements for you. So you might want to take a look at redoing your categories again and seeing what those quick financials will do for you in FRX. Next thing let's look at, level of posting from series. With the price of hardware and things these days, you can keep a lot of data. So I recommend Detail. Makes it a lot easier to recognize, and Detail from all series. But look right next to there in Include and Lookup. Notice I only have the purchasing series selected. Now, there are times, especially with employees, you might have employees set up as vendors and as employees. So there might be times when you post to the accounts payable account in payroll or another module, but I just have mine set to include this account in lookups in the purchasing series. So I highlighted some of those things on the slides, and handouts are also available so you can take a look at these when you're done or as you're going through this video as well. So what's next? Checking our posting setups. Let's go to that window in GP. And again, I'm looking at the purchasing series. And let's look at computer checks. First thing I notice, we've got an oops here. We're never posting checks to the general ledger. We need to make sure to do that. Notice I marked post to general ledger. What will this do for me? It'll post in the purchasing series but stop, and someone in the general ledger will have to post the batch there. Sometimes I've seen those batches get deleted. If you're worried about that, you might want to go ahead and mark post through the general ledger instead. Now, create a journal entry per transaction or batch, and or use account settings are some additional options to have. Then, do you allow people to post without a batch? If you do, you'll want to mark allow transaction posting, but a lot of people want that extra control and require that everyone put things into a batch. Now, if you are creating a journal entry per transaction, you'll notice you'll have the posting date option from the batch or the transaction. Now this gets really important as you get towards the beginning and ends of the month, because if your batch date is in July, but your transaction date is in June, those end of month reconciles are going to be difficult. So again, pay close attention of what you're doing here. Now, if you want additional controls of verifying number of transactions, batch amounts, and doing batch approvals, those options are here as well. Now, the next thing is the reports. Now, in all honesty, if you print the distribution detail, do you need the distribution summary as well? You'll notice that I only have the first report selected. I can add the detail up to get the summary information myself, so I've unmarked the computer check distribution summary. What's another hint I have for you? You'll notice my check register. I require that we print the check register to the printer and put it in our files every time we do computer checks. So you'll notice I have it marked to send it right to the printer, so it doesn't ask me printer or screen each time. So I've got that marked there, whereas these other journals I've got marked to ask me. Now, you may instead want to mark to screen because you want to look at it on the screen and then go ahead and print it to paper. Those are options as well. But like I said, what I see a lot of people doing is canceling tons of reports when they're posting. That's a lot of extra mouse clicks that you don't need if you've got your posting set correctly from the start. And again, the handouts contain some more information about that option. The next thing I want to talk about setting up GP for Success for all staff members is one of my very favorite features, and that's checklists. So when I first started here a few months ago, I was helping someone who was new in cash management at one of our client sites, and I thought, this is a great example of how I might set things up for checklists to make her day-to-day processing easier as well as her month-end processing. So let's again go to GP to see how I might set that up. So under routines, financial, and checklists is where I find my checklist. Now, if you remember, I said it was someone in cash management or bank reconciliation. And she was actually reconciling the bank account every single day because of the high volume of sales and cash input every day. So the first thing we started with every day was downloading what our daily sales are. Now, she had it set up as a shortcut in Internet Explorer. But I thought, why not just create a checklist and do everything within GP? So here you see that I've brought up today's sales report right from within GP, and this is an SSRS report. So how did I make that work? Let's take a look. I'll go ahead and click Modify, but before I even do that, you'll notice this has been updated. So before it said 412 at 120. As you might know, I'm in the Lawson Company, and the user date is always 412 when you first log in. So I didn't really go back in time, but the last time I ran this report, it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But I wanted to show you the date and time is updated as well as the user ID. Now, one thing I want to warn you about is that date and time is updated as soon as I click. Doesn't mean I actually downloaded the report once it loaded. Just a hint there. But you'll see I added the downloaded sales report, made it an external task, pointed it to launch Internet Explorer, and told it what the URL is I want to point to. Now don't worry about hurriedly writing all of this down and that you can't see this whole thing. Again, all of this is in your handouts. So what do I do after I download my report? Well, I capture them in my monthly Excel sales spreadsheet. So I've got to get out, launch Excel and all of that, or go find my saved Excel spreadsheet, right? No, I can simply click again right within GP, and Excel is launched with my report now. I was kind of lazy this month, and I've only created 2 days for the month for my daily sales, but you get where I'm going. I would create my 31 tabs for my 31 days and get that information there. Again, I just created this item as an external task, but instead of pointing to my Internet Explorer launcher, I pointed to my Excel launcher and the file I wanted launched. Now the next thing I want to do is actually download the bank statement. So again, close GP, minimize it, go to Internet Explorer, go to my favorites there, right? No need. Again, I can double click here and it'll launch my bank site. Now, we won't look at my actual balance today, but I would sign in and get that information and get started there. Now, I actually integrate some of my cash transactions based on what I've downloaded from the bank. So, again, minimize GP, launch Integration Manager, no need. Simply double click on my item. Integration Manager launches and I'm ready to run my integrations. Then I go ahead and download my cash transactions because I use Electronic Reconcile as well. Well, that was pretty. You knew I wasn't going to have to close GP to open that window. But did you know I didn't have to open that window by using the navigation path? I can launch it right from the checklist here as well. I certainly can. So download cash transactions. How does that one change? Instead of being an external task, you'll notice it's a Microsoft Dynamics GP window. When I click on this application lookup, you'll notice I have my different products, so I can do something from manufacturing or interfund, revenue expense deferrals, or some other type of window as well. And then I have my series there. So how do I know what window I need to open? I navigate to the window as I normally would in GP, and the window is up at the top here, so I know what name I'm looking for. After I've downloaded my cash transactions for Electronic Reconcile, I want to upload my SafePay file to the bank as well. Again, I launch that right from within my checklist. Then I'm going to reconcile the daily statement. So I get to reconcile bank statements in Dynamics GP to run my reconcile. Now, because for cash management, I had set it to post to rather than post through, I'll need to go ahead and mark those CM transaction batches to post and post those. And then finally, this I might not do necessarily on a daily basis, or I might because I've reconciled my bank statement and I've posted all my batches. Now I can reconcile cash from the Bank Rec module for my specific checkbook and run those accounts and do my reconciliation process that way. So all of my daily items at my fingertip, and I can see in a matter of just 7 minutes, I've done all my day's work. Probably not, but you can see how I might have left off at step 4 and got a phone call. I don't remember exactly where I was. This might help me out. And like I said, as I'm training someone new, rather than them having to write down all of these separate paths, create all these favorites in an Internet Explorer and things like that, I've created a checklist for them for their day right in Dynamics GP. Now, when month end comes or period end comes, or for us, when payday comes, we have to transfer the appropriate amount of cash from our operating account into our payroll account to cover those payrolls. So you'll notice on payday, I've added that I need to do that bank transfer transaction as well, as a reminder for myself. Now a checklist with one item, would I actually remember to check the checklist? Maybe not, but you can see that I've got quite a few possibilities with my different series, my different frequencies, and I've even got user defined. So we've got daily, like I said, payday, period end, month end, quarter end, there's probably specific quarter end reports to run, and fiscal and calendar year, as we all know, is one of our busiest times of the year. And so your checklist might be especially long for those times. Now I know not everyone gets as excited about checklists as I do, But I hope with these explanations today and the handouts I've provided showing you how to set up each of these tasks, you'll think about how you might be able to use checklists in your organization. Now, let's talk about day-to-day navigation as well. Did you know that you can restrict items in your lookup windows? How many vendors do you have with the same letters and things like that because a vendor changed locations? And so you just created a new vendor ID for them or things like that. And then how many times do you post to? Hopefully not. Hopefully you set them as inactive. But how many times have you selected an inactive vendor and dealt with the error messages? To save yourself some time, let's take a look at what we can do in GP. I go to Transactions, Purchasing Transaction Entries, since I was talking about vendors, and we'll get to this later. You'll see I have autocomplete on. I know I'm going to use one of my B vendors, but I can't remember which one. So I hit B and Control L. Again, shortcuts. We'll get to those later. And I go ahead and choose Bloomington County. But wait, I said we were going to show something. Notice my view says all active vendors by vendor ID. What? I bet yours says all vendors by vendor ID. What I did is I went and excluded inactive vendors last time I was in this window. And then what did I do? I set this as default. So every time I come in this window, I'm excluding the inactive vendors so I don't select them by accident and have to deal with the error and reselecting a vendor ID. Now there are other options as well. We can do restricted lists or favorites. So perhaps when you're in receivables, you choose based on a salesperson or territory or something like that. You can do additional favorites, but it is the all or the exclude inactive that you can set as default. And I don't need to post a transaction today. So let's go back. Shortcuts and autocomplete. As you saw when I was doing my transaction entry and purchasing, my autocomplete was set up. So where do we go and set up these shortcuts, autocomplete, and things like that? Back to GP we go. And you'll notice right off the main menu, Microsoft Dynamics GP, User Preferences. We see where our default report destinations are. Now, how many of you just moved from another system? And the other system, you navigated between fields on a screen using the return key rather than the tab. And now every time you hit the return key, Dynamics GP asks you to save. Well, you can get used to the tab key versus the return key, or here is where you can make that change. So you don't drive yourself crazy every time you hit that return key. Now, where is my autocomplete? Right here. I like showing autocomplete suggestions and up to 10,000 for field. Probably more than enough that I need. The other thing I want to make sure I point out is in display. For new people, again, how many times have you tried to save a record or a new person has tried to save a record and it gives them the error? Not all required fields are entered and they don't know which are the required fields. You'll notice we set ours up often by default as red and bold so we know in our windows which are the required fields. And also notice that prompts are underlined. So if something shows up as underlined, I know that I can navigate back in my window using that. Now what about shortcuts? You'll notice over here I have a shortcut to accounts. And that's one of my reports I have set up. But I also have, going back to home, my shortcut to my reconcile bank statements right here on my shortcut bar. So how did I get that there? Well, let's add another item. So I was just doing payables transaction entry. On the bar here, I go to File, Add to Shortcuts, and there's my payables transaction entry. Now, yes, I'm old school. You see I use my key more than my mouse a lot of times. So how do I make those changes? Go to Shortcut Properties, and I can set that to my F10 key. So every time I hit F10, open Payables Transaction Entry. So we looked at autocomplete, adding items to shortcuts, changing our shortcut properties, and the other things we can change in user preferences. So, finally, let's look at information from GP. Now, I hope many of you are as familiar with SmartList as I am. You'll see how quick and easy it is to get information from that. But have you ever thought, gee, this is just a list. I still have to use my calculator, create formulas in Excel, and do all of those things. Are there easier ways to do this? Well, hopefully you know you can create macros and things like that. But have you discovered the wonder of pivot tables? I've shown a couple of customers how to do this with SmartList in the last month, and I tell you, I've got some huge fans. So let's take a look. So I go to SmartList, and since I was working in cash management, I'm going to start there in bank transactions. Now, the default one with the asterisks will pull my first 1,000 records. But a lot of times what we're doing is something very specific, and working with all records isn't exactly going to work with us. So we're going to go ahead and do some searches. Now what happened is I'm getting ready to send the money to the state for all my checks that haven't cleared in the last few years. So I can go ahead and do some searches on that. So what I'm going to do is close this one out and go to the one I've already created called Stilled Checks. You'll see I've added my checkbook ID, my posting date, descriptions, where it came from, the checkbook amount, and then I've added this reconciled column. Because if reconciled is no, it means it hasn't cleared the bank. So I've got these transactions. Now I need to provide a report and do some entries based on some totals here. So I'm going to export this to Excel. And I've got my different lists. Now you might think, well, I'll just go ahead and filter and sum and things like that. Or like I said, what we could do is go to Insert, Pivot Table. It recognizes this SmartList as a list of items, and the detail works. I add it to a new sheet. So in my rows, I want the amounts for my different checkbooks. And what do I want? I want a sum of my checkbook amounts. There, easy to make my entry. Now, I also have to provide more of a detailed report to the state to know what are each one of those checks that make up the totals for each of this checkbook. So I move my checkbook ID over to the columns, and then I can add the transaction date, or I might want to add something else like a description, the checkbook number, things like that, so I can see all of the different information. And you'll notice when I enter years, if I want to see per quarter, summed up, all of that type of information. Pivot tables and pivot charts are something really easy to create. Once you've done it, you'll start playing with them quite a bit and seeing how much value they add to getting information from GP. Also, in GP 2015 and later, we have some additional charts and KPIs that ship by default. You'll notice these reports are using my local report server, and I can see a nice easy chart for showing my top 5 customers by year-to-date sales. So here are my top 5 customers. And what's really nice about us shipping these to you out of the box, if you've got a programmer on site, they can take a look at these reports and create some additional reports, or it gives you an idea of the possibilities and things we might be able to create for you here at ITI. So thank you for listening to my session, Dynamics GP Tips and Tricks, Setting Your System Up for Success. I hope you've enjoyed the session and get a lot of use out of the handouts. Thank you. Goodbye.